So, welcome everybody. I'm going to share the screen here in a minute, and we're working. I think I sent out something a little bit ago about working through the lectures that are published in this book, The Pathwork of Self Transformation. It was one of the first books that was published that drew from the Pathwork lecture material, and they're a little bit edited and have some commentary with them, but they're basically the lectures, just as you can get them online. But it's a great compilation of sort of really sort of the sort of most foundational pathwork lectures for people to sort of comprehend what this is like and stuff like that. So I thought that might be a good sort of intro place for some of the new people that are, exploring with us now. So this lecture is called The Idealized Self-Image. And there's a little commentary here. Most of us grow up believing that we are not good enough to be loved for just being ourselves. So we try desperately to live up to a self-centered, self-created image of how we should be. So see if you can connect to that part in you or recognize that within yourself. So the constant struggle to uphold this idealized version of ourselves causes many of our difficulties. And I would say it's like even like sort of the most foundational, fundamental split. It's the split within ourselves against ourselves. And that creates all of the other splits. So, it's therefore very important to discover on what assumptions we've, created our own idealized image and how it has caused this distress and frustration in our life, because how we naturally see it is like sort of the solution to the pain and frustration in our life. And it doesn't work that way. And an unconscious level, it actually creates more of what we're trying to avoid. So you'll find that it has achieved the exact opposite of what you had hoped it would. This discovery may be painful, but will allow you to reevaluate the way you are presenting yourself to the world and help you to become your true relaxed self. I was kind of amused a little bit in, I think the Webster's word of the year, or is authenticity, right? And I've heard that a lot, how to become our authentic self. And the pathwork, I think, was the original, spiritual path that was working exactly with that. How do we become our authentic self? So, beginning with the guide's words, he says, "Greetings. God bless all of you, my dearest friends. The higher self, the lower self, and the mask" is the first sub-chapter here. He says, "In an effort to understand human nature better, imagine it as represented by three concentric spheres. The central sphere, the innermost core, is the higher self, which is part of the universal intelligence and love that pervades life. In short, it's part of God. It is the divine spark. The higher self is free, spontaneous, creative, loving, giving, all-knowing, and capable of uninterrupted joy and bliss." Right? So this sounds like, sort of far from where we live generally, right? But it's alive in all of us in varying degrees. And wherever we are free, spontaneous, creative, loving, then, intuitively knowing, right? All of this, we know is coming through us from this level of our being. And you can always get in touch with it when you are in truth and when you give from your heart and through meditation and prayer. The layer that surrounds the divine self is the hidden world of egocentricity that we call the lower self. So this is your undeveloped part, which still contains negative emotions, thoughts, and impulses, such as fear, hate, or cruelty. So, and I would say, one of the ways that I've come to look at the lower self in a way that, when I first came in, it kind of seemed like the big, bad thing that you want to be afraid of or something. But there's a way in which, you can also see it as like our individual separated self nature, right? Our experience being in the body. And so, it's the three lower chakras, right? It's the root chakra, which is concerned with, survival in the world. And so it's, our animal defenses and our animal ways of, having things like fear and, being a vulnerable, being on earth and needing to, have this, protection and basic survival, right? And so then we also have the second chakra, which is our desire, our longing, but it can then become the self will or what we are, think we should have or what we take, by killing somebody else or whatever. So, it's how we use these forces, right? The forces themselves are a part of being a human being incarnated on the planet.
Darlene, it was interesting as I was thinking immediately of the sun, moon, and ascendant as like
Okay.
the core components of a character in astrology, because
Uh,
the moon is your kind of like higher self, your emotional body, and then the sun is more of like your 3D personality in this life, and then the ascendant is like the mask. So I mean,
uh-huh.
there's a lot more to it than that, but I mean, it kind of lined up quite
Similar,
nicely.
right? Yeah, yeah. You know, I think there is these truths are kind of multidimensional through all of these systems, and so it's kind of for me it's exciting when I find that correspondence in another system because it just kind of confirms to me the truth of what's being taught, and so that's great. And so then I would say like the third chakra, right, would be sort of that ego self that wants to have status and pride and not be ashamed and like that kind of thing. And so it's the pride, self-will, and fear of the lower self coming through the unheld, unintegrated human part of us that's still vulnerable. And, so once we can awaken sort of more of our higher self actually and bring that presence through, which has faith, which has, uh, some like self-love and these kinds of things, then from that place, I don't think we're actually holding and supporting these more individualistic parts of ourselves within the larger whole of the higher self. And so the higher self can calm the fears. The higher self can remind us of prayer and faith or, something like that when we're in a tizzy or we're, being triggered or something like that. And so, like my sense is that when we can be present through that higher self, we can, really support and help the lower self in its evolutionary sort of maturing, because it's just it's like a small child, vulnerable and traumatized usually, and in our world, in some way or another. So I don't always see the lower self. Now there is evil in the world, and I'm not, we can get into that at some point too, and how all of that works together. But at a certain level, I think it's good to sort of demystify and you know, evilize the lower self. Uh, and so I don't know if that's, makes sense, but see if you can just kind of hold it not as a bad thing in us, right? Don't judge it, but see it as having its place. But it's kind of like trying to function, in a larger, like it's trying to be the king when it really is just a child. It's trying to run the system and it doesn't know how. And we have to kind of surrender into learning this larger journey of connecting to the divine self. So, and we can, I like that he says, that we can get in touch with it when we're in truth, and the guide is always saying when we're in our meditations or when we're working in our process to ask, what is truth? And he says, when you give from your heart, right? and through meditation and prayer. So one of the things that I've been focusing a lot on is really connecting to this giving from my heart, or connecting to the heart chakra and the aspect of the heart that I can live through instead of live through my lower chakras, right? So I'm trying to sort of bring my consciousness up to the heart level. So the layer that surrounds the divine self is the hidden world of egocentricity that we call the lower self. I read that tonight. Okay, so now we're at the mass self. So the outermost layer, which people cover up their lower selves and often even their higher selves as a protective shield, is the mass self, or idealized self-image. Needless to say, there are many degrees and stages within each of these levels of consciousness. The way they overlap, cancel each other out, and create confusion, along with indirect effects and chain reactions, needs to be explored and understood. This work of exploration is what you are engaged in on this path. All these aspects of personality can be conscious or unconscious to varying degrees. The less awareness you have of them, the more conflict will be in your life, and the less you will be equipped to deal with the challenges that come your way. If your awareness is low, it will slow down the progress of transformation by which you will eventually integrate your lower self and your mass self into your divine center. So notice, we're not saying that we got to get rid of our lower self, or, reject our mass self or anything like that. It's like the whole movement of the path is to unify and to connect with and to integrate. And that's how it evolves, rather than rising above, rejecting and trying to, deny it within ourselves. So it's about the mass self, or the idealized self-image, that I want to speak to you tonight. Pain is part of the human experience, beginning with birth. Through pleasure, though pleasurable experiences are bound to follow the painful ones, the knowledge and fear of pain are always present. The most significant countermeasure to which people resort in the false belief that it will circumvent unhappiness, pain, and even death is the creation of the idealized self-image as a universal pseudo-solution. It is supposed to be a means of avoiding unhappiness. So if only I'm perfectly such and such a way, then everybody will love me, or everybody will, be afraid of me and take care, do what I want or whatever. But at least somehow, if I can, live up to and manifest this ideal self that I am projecting in my imagination, that self, rather than the authentic self, is somehow how I can get what I want, feel good, and, make sure that, people are relating to me in an appropriate way or whatever. So it's supposed to be a means of avoiding the unhappiness, insecurity, and lack of belief in oneself that, they're all interconnected, right? And we all have, from our early woundings, some sense of, insecurities. Like you said, from birth, we've had pain. There's unhappiness. And so by pretending to be what one is not, that is, by creating the idealized self, one hopes to reestablish happiness, security, and self-confidence. We look around, if I were like that person, if I compare myself, oh, I should be like that, that would give me self-confidence. Or we read a self-help book or whatever,
Well, I was
and
going to say, also, I find it really amusing that I have like a infinite deck of masks sometimes, like, is because even if you can possibly accomplish kind of that standard or some semblance of it, then it's like, oh no, that wasn't the mask, it was this one. Or right, there's just, it's like rotating.
yeah, they're layered, and they're also, different ones at different times, or, it's like, and I mean, and I don't think it's in this lecture. I think it's in the next one, Love, Power, and Serenity. But the guy basically talks about how, we we have a certain, there's those three types of masks, right? And so they can be used in different circumstances. And oftentimes we'll start with one, and if that doesn't work, we'll go to the next one and that kind of thing. Um, so yeah, definitely layers and multiple rotating masks. In truth and reality, healthy and genuine self-confidence is peace of mind. It is security and healthy independence, and allows one to achieve a maximum of happiness through developing one's inherent talents, leading a constructive life, and entering into fruitful human relationships. But since the self-confidence established through the idealized self is artificial, the result cannot possibly be what was expected. Actually, the consequence is quite the contrary and frustrating because cause and effect are not obvious to you. You need to grasp the significance, the effects, the damages, and the links between your unhappiness and your idealized self-image, and to fully recognize in what particular way does it manifest in your individual case. To find this requires a great deal of work. The dissolution of the idealized self is the only possible way to find your true self, to find serenity and self-respect, and to live your life fully. So any comments here? Let me pause and just see if anybody else wants to chime in. So I will reiterate, that it really is the only possible way to find our true self, to find serenity, self-respect, and to live life fully is to dissolve the idealized self-image, right? And basically we created it when we were little, and it was the only thing we knew, and it kind of worked maybe in some ways, so it's tough. And then it kind of like it sort of tried to help us, but then it became our own bully. It became our own inner, abuser in some ways. And so, this is where part of the cost is we have no idea. It's kind of largely still in the unconscious, or maybe even your voice of your idealized self-image speaks to you very calmly and rationally, my dear, that wasn't a good thing, but it's still judging, it's still rejecting, it's still, even when it's doing it nicely. And my voice doesn't sound like that. My voice, like, really gets frustrated and angry at me and abusive, right? So that voice, when I tune into it, it feels like it needs to do that in order to, wake me up or help me change or something. And yet you can see in some ways that it's resonant of sort of maybe how it felt as a child, right? How the parents would be afraid and correct you, or want you to be a different way than you were, and make fun of you.
Mine is like the cone heads, and that the cone heads.
Yeah, I
They're
remember
like, oh, you're doing something that is not resonating well with the rest of the human species in the general vicinity. Try the next tactic.
Right.
Moving on.
And so we learn, we're not like them, we're not part of them, something's wrong with us, right? All of this kind of thing. So we end up, we come by it honestly, right? And we come by it from, our attempt to survive as children. So we don't want to judge this idealized self-image either. We want to recognize that mostly it's operating out of fear, and trying to help us survive. And if we can meet it at that survival place, then I think, we can help it see the truth that survival isn't really at stake here in this moment, and kind of work with it and calm it and help it transform, these forces, these currents in us that we got imprinted with and maybe we brought in as part of our soul journey. So, fear of pain and punishment. As a child, regardless of what your particular circumstances were, you were indoctrinated with admonitions on the importance of being good, holy, and perfect. When you were not, you were often punished in one way or another. Perhaps the worst punishment was that your parents withdrew their affection from you. They were angry and you had the impression you were no longer loved. Of course, also it can be much worse than that, right? But even that is huge to the child. No wonder badness associated itself with punishment and unhappiness, and goodness with reward and happiness. Hence, to be good and perfect became an absolute must. It became a question of life or death for you. Still, you knew perfectly well that you were not as good or as perfect as the world seemed to expect you to be. This fact had to be hidden. It became a guilty secret, and you started to build a false self. This, you thought, would be your protection and your means of attaining what you desperately wanted: life, happiness, security, self-confidence. The awareness of this false front began to vanish, but you were and are permanently permeated with the guilt of pretending to be something you are not. You strain harder and harder to become this false self, this idealized self. You were and unconsciously still are convinced that if you strain hard enough, one day you will be that self. But through this artificial attempt to squeeze yourself into something that you are not, you can never attain genuine self-improvement, self-purification, and growth. You started building an unreal self on a false foundation and left your real self out. In fact, you are desperately hiding it. So the moral mask of the idealized self. The idealized self-image may assume many forms. It does not always dictate standards of generally recognized perfection. Oh yes, the idealized self-image often does impose high moral standards, making it all the more difficult to question its validity, right? Isn't it right to want to be always decent and always loving and understanding and never angry and to have no faults, but to try to attain perfection? That's a good thing, right? Isn't that what we're supposed to do? And when we are kind of aligned in that, it seems logical. It seems very rational. It seems the truth at some deep level. So we don't even kind of realize and recognize that hidden in that is something poisonous for us. So such considerations make it difficult for you to discover the compulsive attitude that denies present imperfection, such as the pride and lack of humility that prevents you from accepting yourself as you are now. So this is an important piece that I want to just highlight here. Like, a lot of times the idealized self-image is really struggling, against shame, and against judgment. And so, there's a way that there's this kind of way that pride and shame are the flip side of the same coin. And to me, the way that we actually unify and integrate both pride and shame into the higher self is this middle place that I know as humility. And Jonathan Goldman, one of my teachers in the, energy work and stuff, he talks about, like, at the very, very center of our heart chakra, the very core, where it's down in the central power current, like there's a place that's the, opening of that heart chakra in our system. And right there at the very center is the space of humility. So I don't know if you want to explore this, but just kind of bring your attention into your body at your heart level and kind of go in to the very, almost all the way back to your spinal cord, right? And see if you can feel a space or feel, connect with humility and feel if it sort of resonates in that space. Or when you go there, does it give you a sense of letting go of sort of the perfectionism and accepting the simple self that you are, with imperfections and all, still a child of God, still a divine core, but young, like a child, right? And so instead of trying to be bigger, more grown up than we are, which is like really a struggle, it's this grace of just accepting that we are as we are, and we can see that we're doing the work. So we're, not frittering our life away or doing, something evil with our time or anything, so in a way, the guide is saying, we're serving the best cause in life. And so we should have, a good sense of our firmness and our worth, right? That we have value, that we are beloved of God, and that we don't have to be anything more than we are. And it's only by being exactly where we are and who we are that we can move to the next level. If we try to avoid who we are and where we are and get to the next level, we're not going to get there. It's kind of like, if you're on the ground, you can have purchase and you can move forward. If you say, I'm not allowed to be there, I have to be, up here. And then you're, trying to live up in your idealized version of yourself, your legs are just dangling and they're not on the ground. They can't go anywhere, they're just flopping in the air. So, the idealized self-image kind of does that. It ungrounds us, and then it says, okay, change, be better, but we can't do it from there. It's not even possible. So we have to kind of like drop down and come into our real self, come into just who we are, and see if we can, love and honor ourselves as God would. And if you can't, to consider, like, well, is that sort of, sort of telling God that he didn't know what he was doing, like, God, you shouldn't love me, I'm terrible, right? In some way, like God must be wrong to care for us, is kind of an underlying, I think, supposition in this that we don't often recognize. And so the more ways that we can bring out, and see the false flag here, and see, the cost that it has, the pain and the suffering that it creates. And the more that we can just drop down into this place of our true self, which is not perfect, but is just as we are, but has a desire, has a longing, wants to evolve, wants to go forward. And that's a beautiful thing. And that's all we need. So such considerations when we're, trying to attain perfection, and never be angry or anything, like, we think that's what we're supposed to be like. But, if you're angry, you're angry. And the only way that you're going to resolve that anger is to not run away from it, but to be with it, explore it, try not to act it out or hurt somebody with it, maybe. Notice if it's against yourself, how that feels and what that's doing, and if it's working and if it's really appropriate. But that's all a part of just kind of accepting where we are in each moment. And we also have our taboos, what we shouldn't ever do or ever be. So pay attention, what are your sort of list of things that you're not allowed to show up as? These are part of our shadow, because we all have every human trait and quality within us, right? And part of our learning to love each other and love our enemies comes from accepting that, all of that is within us as well. So, any comments, questions? So we're looking at this compulsive attitude in the idealized self that wants to deny our present imperfections and has this pride and lack of humility that prevents you from accepting yourself as you are now. The pretense and the shame that goes with it, because the ISI is like kind of the source of the shaming that we do to ourselves now, in the name of, trying to improve ourselves or whatever. But shame is a very toxic thing, right? And it's not in truth. And then when we do it to ourselves or do it to others, it's harmful. So there's also the fear of exposure, the secretiveness, the tension, strain, guilt, and anxiety. And all of these things are created by the idealized self-image. So if you're feeling any of those things, tension, strain, guilt, fear of exposure, whatever, it's like a signal that your idealized self-image is probably active in you. And so we can kind of recognize it in that way as well. So it will take some progress in this work before you begin to experience the difference in feeling between the genuine desire to gradually work towards growth and the ungenuine pretense imposed upon you by the dictates of your idealized self. You will discover the deeply hidden fear that says your world will come to an end if you do not live up to its standards. You will sense and know many other aspects and differences between the genuine and the ungenuine self. And you will also discover what your particular idealized self demands. So we each have, certain things, often what we were taught, but also certain ones that we've added to the list of, what we need to be like to be okay. And there are also facets of the idealized self depending on personality, life conditions, and early influences, which are not and cannot be
Darling, actually, I
considered.
had a quick
Yeah,
question.
good.
So this also includes situations where your idealized self also creates a false ceiling. For instance, like you've kind of been taught, like, don't stand out, don't you know don't like have too much, or don't show off, or right. Okay.
And so you were shamed by that, and then basically you interject that voice of shaming and do it to yourself,
Then you're
right?
never kind of allowing yourself to act naturally,
Exactly.
and then it acts as like a stumbling block to where you would, I don't want to say like find success, but where you would just naturally flow and develop.
Right,
Okay.
right, right. And even in relationship, people want to relate to the real self, and yet we're terrified, oh, they won't like me if I'm my real self. I've got to be my mask. But the truth is, if we, start connecting with each other from our masks, we're not really connected, and now we're in competition. Oh, is my mask better than her mask? Am I doing, because we're still in, so there's no real love or relationship from that place. So we have to drop into this real self, to have any kind of flow in life and not be kind of depressing. I mean, we can get into a place where we really feel bad about ourselves and who we are, and that voice just, it's not even a voice, it's kind of almost an attitude or an inner, self-judgment that just, like, I'm, as long as you're the way you are, I'm never going to be happy. Right? There's
Yeah,
this,
I was thinking there's less of a voice when this comes, and more of like just a fear, just like a visceral fear
right,
response, like
right.
where you just kind of come up against a barrier
Yeah,
where you're like, oh wait, am I doing something that's going to make others around me feel uncomfortable? I better, like, kind of tone it down.
right.
It's like a generational trauma. It's like a pattern that like the society has, and you kind of get that shame for, yeah, for um like I don't know, like especially in my culture, it's you are so much ridiculed if you stand out that it's just crazy. And I observe those patterns in me. I just watch them a lot of times come up, like daily, really. But yeah, I don't know. It's the way to do it is observe, right? That's the
Yeah,
first step.
well, it's part of, when these feelings arise within us. I mean, it's like people are getting more conscious of them and the feelings in the body, and how it kind of impacts the whole psyche in a way. But there is, I think, a way that we need to consciously go in and work with it. And there is some ways to do that with the path work as well, and there's so much more to understand, and we can unravel this within us, but we have to meet it where it is instead of run away from it, or, just sort of, give it a description or give it a label or, see what it is, but then kind of say, but I can't touch that with it. I don't want to go there. Right. So, and usually we're like that because we're identified with it. Right. We think that's who it is and we don't have our observer present enough. And so it's this sort of pain body state that's lost in its self-consciousness and its lack of confidence. And it's the child self again, and it's by itself again. It doesn't have the presence of the higher self to support it, right? So I think
I like
part
something
of what
that,
we're
that
trying to do
Skylar
is,
said too.
huh?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I like that she said about the generational trauma, because what's interesting is a lot of people's parents, I mean, whether you're from like another country or if they were just had a lot of poverty, which is the case with my parents, they kind of said, we're doing all this for you, right? Like we've sacrificed our entire lives so that, you know, the next generation is going to have it good. And the funny thing is that that worked, but then they also kind of put in subconsciously a self-destruct mechanism, because both my sister and I went to good colleges and are doing well for ourselves, but we also have like this terrible shame and guilt because like we took away our parents' lives. Apparently, that's like the false conclusion, right? Like they had no life because it just
Right.
worked all the time for us, right? That was the narrative.
And maybe they reminded you of that a lot or something.
Right. So that's kind of like in the back of your head. And then it's funny because that mirrors very specifically how the individual creates the story mask. And then that's actually like, say, I wanted to fit in with people, but then or connect with people, and then but I make this mask that like pushes people away or whatever, right? So it's like it has the opposite effect. And then it's kind of interesting how the generational stories have the opposite effect as well. So I just thought that was a neat parallel.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And there's this whole recreation thing and this whole, ongoing. I mean, even from the soul level, the guide says, like we incarnate back in these situations to move them forward, right? And so, we are, in some ways both wounded, wounded by those parents that didn't have it, but they had less than we did, and they did as best as they could to move us forward, right? And they were limited because of their background and their, suffering as well. And so, it's in some ways where you can't point the fingers in this work very well, right? It's really either something that we're choosing to take on, to explore, and to, heal within ourselves and for our ancestral, clan pattern traumas, that the soul really is this being of light that chooses to come in and take on, crucifying itself on the earth plane of matter in order to try to bring bring that state that is, in a negative vibrational, place into a higher level. And so in a way, we're each acting as the Christ, bringing in our imperfections and our limitations and, even our own self-crucifying kinds of qualities to, go into, through, and out the other side of that to find our way back and home. So, and it's again, like it's real. We're, wounded by this stuff for sure. And yet, it's not that there's a victim. We're not a victim here. And we came in, and the more that we can see ourselves and recognize this longer journey and accept this. It's like life is not a vacation, it's an initiation, right? And so we have to kind of accept life on its own terms, which sometimes is difficult. But the guide says, we're really supported in that. And that's the other thing is we, connected to our higher self are the angels and all of the higher divine qualities and all of that. And if we weren't so lost in our lower self confusion, we would have access to that support. And so for me, a part of what we're trying to do really, is to clear this is to have a greater connection with our higher self, because that will make a huge difference in everything that we're going through. But the first step is to recognize this, ISI, and to, kind of, as we see the cost of it, right, then we can ask, we can seek, well, what's another way, or how can I heal this? And in speaking to, the higher self within us, maybe we can be inspired or shown as we're in there working with a particular aspect of that idealized self-image, what we could say to it, how we could help it, understand and let go, say thank you for helping me all this time. Your defenses were better than nothing, but we're getting to where I'm here now and I don't need you. You don't need to go through that anymore, right? And so we're going to kind of replace, in a way we thought, we set the idealized self-image up in us to represent the parent and God. So, like the idealized self-image is like this God image also, that's how we should be, for God to love us, or all of that. And, when we can, really recognize that that's not God, that God is love, that, God accepts us just as we are, that, he sees that we're doing the best we know how in any given instance, that life is difficult and we get quite lost down here, in the confusion of it all. And that, we can, because we are seekers, reach out for the help that we need, and it will be given. Sometimes we don't always know how to access it. And when we are in our ISI, we can't. So, part of helping us transform this, is really a huge thing, because it is like the block to receive our divine support.
I think it was interesting what Skylar said about her culture,
Mm-hmm.
where you could be ridiculed for being seen, essentially, is what it sounded like to me. Skylar, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's kind of like the general evolvement of, I don't know, human being. It's everything just, I don't know, it's so much lagging. I mean, I guess I don't want to be generalize everything, but the place where I grew up, it's because there's a lot of struggle, people just trying to make the ends meet, and they don't think about anything higher than that. They're just so focused on that. So therefore the consciousness is just very kind of like down that level. People are not really aware of anything else. They're just, trying to survive. So I guess could understand that. But but like across the culture itself, there's also, I feel like there's just a stigma of, if you stand out, you kind of you don't belong here, kind of you risk. But that's kind of everywhere, right? You risk being alone and till the rest of your life being thrown away, and your family could turn away, not understand you, and all of that kind of things. I don't know.
Can I offer a couple of connections that I think you're referring to, Skylar? I mean, I think there's two things. I mean, I think there are, like, survival oriented cultures, people that, the United States is highly individualized, right? And so, like, here everybody thinks, oh, I have to be seen. And that's the one goal.
Yeah.
But
Like,
in other
likes,
cultures,
how many likes can I get? You know,
Right.
how many clicks can I get?
Right. How can I stand out? Right. But in other cultures, and I think you may even recognize I do in my own family, like my mother, was wounded by people that, were sort of thought that they were better or whatever, and so she did not want me to stand out. Right. Like that was being a braggart. That was being, so there's also a kind of primary narcissistic wound because there's a kind of time in the child's development where there's a primary narcissism where the child needs to be reflected back about their wonderfulness, right? And in a culture that's survival based, you're not going to be able to do that. And also, in certain other situations like mine, where that was part of a wounding in the clan pattern, right? That it's not allowed, and yet growing up in this culture, I certainly that there was the split. Oh, I want to be seen, but it's dangerous to be seen, right? It's not okay to be seen, and so we have both sides.
But
Yeah.
it sounds to me like what Skylar was referring to was like in a communist country,
Yeah.
standing out is more
Dangerous, yeah.
more dangerous than anywhere
you
else.
suffer the consequences. Yeah, if you give up, if you stand out, if in telling on other people too, it's kind of like a thing too. Everyone was scared of that at some
Mhm.
point. So it came
Right.
from generations and generations. It's like
Right.
with the culture, with the sayings, the proverbs in Russian. If you really dig into it, it's just so crazy. Like, why would you even say that? Like, I was going through the proverbs of just particular my cultural ones, and it made me think of like, why do people think that way? Why do they say things like that? Yeah, it's how it
Part of
comes.
survival. It's part of defense. It's part
Yeah.
of like it's not okay to certainly in a political situation like that to stand out, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Be different, right? So we're and in every child also kind of comes across that point in time where, okay, I'm different than my whole family, so I either can be the way they want me to be and be connected, or I can be myself, and then I'm different and separate, right? And so it's almost a universal kind of thing that every child faces in their family situation, and we each choose usually some combination or one way or the other. I choose myself over my family, over connection, or I choose connection over being my unique individual self. Connection and safety and all of that. So good. So, actually, if you guys don't mind, I didn't get a chance to go to the bathroom and so I'm gonna undo our um, thing here for a second and see if we can pause the recording for a minute. Feel free. You're in the middle of. We ready to continue with the reading?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Where was I? So, you will discover the deeply hidden fear that says your world will come to an end if you do not live up to your idealized self-image standards. You will sense and know many other aspects and differences between the genuine and ungenuine self, and you will discover what your particular idealized self demands. So that's where I am. So it's good to kind of even do a list of, like what write down anyway, like all of the expectations, the perfectionism that you have, what you want yourself to be, kind of even make a list of all of those things and what you're not allowed to do too, maybe, or something like that. But it's good to really get into the particulars of this oftentimes as well. So there are facets of the idealized self depending on personality, life conditions, and early influences, which are not and cannot be considered good, ethical, or moral. Aggressive, hostile, proud, over ambitious trends are glorified or idealized. And so some people, would say, to idealize their power, their authority, their, ability to control or intimidate others. And that becomes, their dream of how they're going to be great in the world. So it's true that these negative tendencies exist behind all idealized self-images. In some ways, they're always, trying to get the angle by for control in some way. But they are hidden. And since they crassly contradict the morally high standards of the particular idealized self-image, they cause additional anxiety in that the idealized self will be exposed for the fraud it is. The person who glorifies negative tendencies, believing them to prove strength and independence, superiority and aloofness, would be deeply ashamed of the kind of goodness another person's idealized self uses as a front, and would consider it as a weakness, vulnerability, and dependency in an unhealthy sense. So this is, I think, another kind of interesting thing that these masks like really can't stand each other. The power mask thinks that the love mask is really terrible and a weak and vulnerable and wimpy independent thing, and the love mask thinks the power mask is a totally, abusive and a superior and awful person. And then the serenity mask thinks that both the love mask and the power mask are just ridiculous and wants to be above it all, right? So we end up kind of splitting in our world and fighting between our masks. We actually, early on in the Pathwork program, when we had a whole large group, we would divide up and kind of identify which was our mask, and we would see how we really rejected the other masks, right? And that's really what we're rejecting in most people when we are rejecting them, is we're rejecting their masks. So
sorry, that's why they say it's whatever you're not accepting of in other people or arguing against. It's kind of like it's deeply somewhere part of you that you
right,
reject.
it's our shadow in some level, right? Our shadow, the part of our shadow self, a denied aspect of ourself that we are deeply ashamed of, right? In some way. So yeah, so let's see, such a person would entirely overlooks the fact that nothing makes a person as vulnerable as pride. Nothing causes so much fear. In most cases, there is a combination of these two tendencies: over exacting moral standards, impossible to live up to, and pride in being invulnerable, aloof, and superior. The coexistence of these mutually exclusive ways presents a particular hardship for the psyche. Needless to say, the conscious awareness of this contradiction is missing until this particular work is well in progress. There are many more facets, possibilities, and individual pseudo-solutions combining all sorts of mutually exclusive behaviors. So this is where we get into these splits inside of us, right? One part of us says we should be this way, and another part, says we shouldn't, we should be some other way, and we are stuck in the middle. So this is all that has to be a study. It has to be found out individually. And so he says, let us now consider some of the general effects of the existence of the idealized self-image and some of the implications. Since the standards and dictates of the idealized self are impossible to realize. And did I bring the recording back on? I forgot.
Yes, you did.
Okay. Okay, good. So, ADHD. Let us now consider some of the general effects of the existence of the idealized self and some of the implications. Since the standards and dictates of the idealized self are impossible to realize, and yet you never give up the attempt to uphold them, you cultivate within yourself an inner tyranny of the worst order. You do not realize the impossibility of being as perfect as your idealized self demands. And you never give up whipping yourself, castigating yourself, and feeling a complete failure whenever it is proven that you cannot live up to its demands. A sense of abject worthlessness comes over you whenever you fall short of these fantastic demands and engulfs you in misery. This misery may at times be conscious, but most of the time it is not. Even if it is, you do the pretense and the shame. Yeah, I think I lost my place. Hold on. Even if you do, it is not realize the entire significance, the impossibility of what you expect from yourself. When you try to hide your reactions to your own failure, you use special means to avoid seeing it. One of the most common devices is to project the blame for failure onto the world, onto others, onto life. The more you try to identify with your idealized self-image, the harder the disillusionment whenever life brings you into a position where this masquerade can no longer be maintained. Many a personal crisis is based on this dilemma, rather than on outer difficulties. These difficulties then become an added menace beyond their objective hardship. The existence of the difficulties is a proof to you that you are not your idealized self, and this robs you of the false self-confidence you tried to establish with the creation of the idealized self. There are many personality types who know perfectly well that they cannot identify with their idealized self. So that's some people like identify and think that they are pretty much, they still have these little beating places, but a lot of people realize and feel, hopeless and helpless because they want to be so much more than they feel they are. And so then they just despair. They believe they ought to be able to live up to it, and their whole life is permeated with a sense of failure, while the former type experiences it only on more conscious levels when outer and inner conditions culminate in showing up the phantom of the idealized self for what it really is, an illusion, a pretense, and a dishonesty. It amounts to saying, I know I am imperfect, but I make believe I am perfect. Not to recognize this dishonesty is comparably easy when rationalized by conscientious, honorable standards and goals and a desire to be good. So the genuine desire to better oneself leads one to accept one's personality as it is now. If this basic premise is the main governing force of your motivation for perfection, any discovery of where you fall short of your ideals will not throw you into depression, anxiety, and guilt, but will rather strengthen you. You will need not exaggerate the badness of the behavior in question, nor will you defend yourself against it with the excuse that it is the fault of others, of life, or of fate. You will gain an objective view of yourself in this respect, and this will liberate you. You will fully assume responsibility for the faulty attitude, being willing to take the consequences upon yourself. When you act out your idealized self, you dread nothing more than that, for taking the responsibility of your shortcomings upon yourself is tantamount to acknowledging I am not my idealized self. The inner tyrant. Any comments? I'll pause here. The feelings of failure, frustration, and compulsion, as well as guilt and shame, are the most outstanding indications that your idealized self is at work. So let me, the guide also brings these feelings up in other situations, but it's always, a great place to begin with. Like, so if you're feeling a sense of failure, of frustration, of compulsion, of guilt or of shame, you can pretty much guarantee that you're trapped by this idealized self. And that these are the consciously felt emotions out of all of those that lie hidden underneath. Actually, the basis of the tyranny of the idealized self-image is the sense of false shame and false guilt that this image produces when one cannot live up to it. I think as a child, I had this huge amount of false shame and false guilt, and it really was deeply, deeply lost in it. So I thank God for the pathwork for helping me, unravel it all. In addition, the idealized self also manifests false needs, which are superimposed and artificially created, like the need for glory, the need to triumph, to satisfy vanity or pride. The pursuit of these needs never results in true fulfillment. So we get a lot of, sugar highs, a lot of candy icing on the cake or whatever, in sort of the ego pursuit of these false needs. They're like false ego needs. The idealized self has been called into existence in order to attain self-confidence and finally, therefore, happiness and pleasure supreme. The stronger its presence, the more genuine self-confidence fades away. Since you cannot live up to its standards, you think even less of yourself than you originally did. It is therefore obvious that genuine self-confidence can be established only when you remove the superstructure, which is this merciless tyrant, your idealized self. Yes, you could have self-confidence if the idealized self were really you, and if you could live up to these standards. But since this is impossible, and since deep down you know perfectly well you are not anything like what you think you are supposed to be, you build up an additional insecurity with this super self. And further vicious circles come into existence. The original insecurity, which was supposedly whisked away by the establishment of the idealized self, steadily increases. It snowballs and becomes worse and worse. The more insecure you feel, the more stringent the demands of the superstructure, and the less you are able to live up to it, and the more insecure you feel. So this is very familiar vicious circle inside. So if we're feeling insecure, then we think, oh, I should be something better. And then we see how we're not, and then that just adds to our insecurity. And this kind of is a deep internal emotional insecurity type vicious circle as well that just kind of keeps us lost in self-hate and hopelessness. It's very important to see how this vicious circle works, but this cannot be done until and unless you become fully aware of the devious, subtle, unconscious ways in which this idealized self-image exists in your particular case. Ask yourself in what particular area it manifests, what causes and effects are connected with it. Estrangement from the real self. A further and drastic result of this problem is the constantly increasing estrangement from the real self. The ideal self is a falsity. It is a rigid, artificially constructed imitation of a live human being. You may manifest it with many aspects of your real being. Nevertheless, it remains an artificial construct. And the more you invest your energies, your personality, your thought processes, concepts, ideas, and ideals into it, the more strength you take from the center of your being, which alone is amenable to growth. This center of your being is the only part of you, the real you, that can live, grow, and be. It is the only part that can properly guide you. It alone functions with all your capabilities. It is flexible and intuitive. Its feelings alone are true and valid, even if for the moment they are not yet fully in truth and reality, in perfection and purity. But the feelings of the real self function in perfection relative to what you are now. And the more you take out of that live center in order to invest into the robot you have created, the more estranged you become from the real self, and the more you weaken and impoverish it. In the course of this work, you have sometimes come upon the puzzling and often frightening question, who am I really? This is the result of the discrepancy and struggle between the real and the false self. Only upon solving this most vital and profound question will your live center respond and function to its full capacity. Will your intuition begin to function to its full capacity? And will you become spontaneous, free of all compulsions? Will you trust in your feelings because they will have an opportunity to mature and grow? Feelings will become every bit as reliable to you as your reasoning power and your intellect. All this is the final finding of self. And before this can be done, a great many hurdles have to be overcome. It seems to you that this is a life or death struggle. You still believe you need the idealized self in order to live and be happy. Once you understand that this is not so, you will be able to give up the pseudo-defense that makes the maintenance and cultivation of the idealized self seem so necessary. Once you understand that the idealized self was supposed to solve the particular problems in your life, above and beyond your needs for happiness, pleasure, and security, you will come to see the wrong conclusion of this theory. So let me pause here for a minute. How are we doing? I think we're getting close to the end of the chapter, but just see if there's any comments on what we were just talking about. I mean, it's I think really important to kind of again see how yours is operating, because they do come in all different sizes and shapes and layers and levels. And yet, if there's somehow you are dissatisfied with yourself, to go into and examine that very deeply and listen to the voices that say, like, I don't like this, I don't like that, whatever it's unhappy with, right? And yet not just stop there, but, keep asking more questions. Why don't you like it? What death do you die? Because that's there, like, what is the belief that you have inside of you, that makes this something that you have to reject instead of embrace and integrate in yourself. So, as we can, keep exploring, that unravels it, and then we can follow from there, knowing how to transform it.
It occurs to me that truth dissolves the idealized self-image. And again, to say it again, somewhere along the way, the guide said, God is truth, So it's interesting. Truth dissolves the idealized self-image.
And in some ways, I think, the Luciferic consciousness is connected with the ISI, because the guide's saying, that the fall, was created by, Lucifer feeling like, he didn't agree with God, and, like he was, kind of in rebellion in some way, and God's justice wasn't just, but he also doesn't believe in free will, right? And I think the idealized self-image, is the one that sort of says, you have to be a certain way, and it's only this way. And, if you're not, you're condemned, or, something like that. And that feels not like God, which is kind of what we project onto the ISI. Oh, this is the voice of wisdom and truth that tells me how I should be, right? But it's when it turns against us and annihilates us when we are not, that's not God, right?
Yeah.
God.
It's also sort of like a microcosm of in a way, of like the eons of distortion, because it kind of starts out as a somewhat innocent need to project yourself as being more perfect than you actually are.
Yeah.
And as you go through life, it's like a snowball rolling down a hill, picking up one more, projection after another, until you got this whole arsenal of projections you can call on whenever you need to be something other than you actually are, in order to make a good face of things or something like that. It's peculiar. It's a very peculiar aspect of the human psyche.
Right. Right. And, I don't think animals have it. I mean, that's kind of the difference
Okay.
between the animals. They don't have masks, right? They might have lower self for their survival instinct or whatever, but yeah, it's not in service of the mask. And so I think this really does kind of sort of explain the difference in some ways in our consciousness and is how we've gotten so lost. And, yet everybody, I mean, children are bullied, made fun of, parents are, always punishing for not, so like you said, it's an innocent attempt to survive, to try to become, viable in the world that's, confronting us in all of these strange and difficult ways, right? So
And I was going to mention that, and in some cases, as a military officer, we're literally taught command presence as a mask. Like you're like literally taught how to put on a mask.
Yes. Yes. And I mean,
to
I
be
don't,
a more idealized version of yourself.
Right. And I
others.
think in many places where there's hierarchy and authority, you have sort of the authority in that kind of transferential masky place, right? That and that's I think maybe that's going to change as well, but it does seem to be sort of how we've organized and structured community and group, sort of organizations that are task oriented more particularly, right?
And as an individual, I kind of have to ask myself what part of the mask is something that was, kind of created out of trauma, and what part of it is kind of picked up to fit into the organization I work in. And also, what drew me to this organization in the first place was because it just had a more interesting mask that was
Maybe
already prepackaged, and I could just, chuck off my old one and use this one.
right.
Everybody else has the same one, and it's very comfortable.
Right. And there could have been, again, our motives are mixed, right? So there's usually, there could have been something like, a survival or a way of, oh, that's what I want to be like, right? We're kind of all thespians trying on different roles and wanting to put on different masks, right? To discover ourselves. I mean, we really are in a search for who are we really? And a lot of what is attractive to us as a mask is connected to our higher self, our true nature, right? So there's this subtle difference of how we connect with it, and we can find that real part of us and develop that, maybe as a real aspect, or we can again try to superimpose it and establish it more as an act. And that's kind
right.
of
I mean, but I think what I've learned over time is that the difference between mask authority and authentic authority.
Exactly.
I mean, I've learned those sorts of things being in this profession, and
right.
But it's interesting that just looking back, I was attracted to a place where I could work an occupation where you could officially hide.
Uh-huh. Yeah. It's great self-awareness, and it's great, like all of those things are like relevant in your soul's journey to keep exploring and understanding. But yeah, it's like interesting that, something attracted you in that, and it could be multiple things. There could be more stones to uncover there, and some of them might have been, more egoic reasons, and some of them also are higher self, right? And then the real thing is that and then what do we make out of it? Okay, so we make these choices, and sometimes they're admixed in terms of their motivations, and yet in the long run, I think from the higher self perspective, if it's happening, it's we've been given the go ahead, and there's something to learn there, something that we can develop, and there's a lot to learn in that situation about how to be a good authority, about how to command respect and that kind of thing. That's not totally a mask sort of situation, right? And also to see how bad authority works and other things like that. So I think, all of those choices that we make in our journey, right, are exactly perfect for us in some way. And it may not be the end goal, but we're kind of collecting and gathering all of these truths and understandings as we go. And, the longer that we live, the more we can integrate and see the whole picture in an interesting way, and in a fulfilling way, and in a directive way. Oh, this is where I'm supposed to be and what I need to do. So, yeah. And then sometimes there's still times when we have no idea, but it's like there's this trust in sort of the ongoing flow of life taking us where we need to be, even when we're, on the final end of the story, right? If we can do that, it can, I think, really, and a lot of people, I think in our culture, like, we have an idealized self-image about not showing grief or letting anything get us down, or like, so people die and we just keep chugging along. We we're not allowed to have feelings in our culture very much at all. So that's another aspect of, I think, our cultural mask.
It's like part of survival mechanism again. Like
Mhm.
prey animals, right? You don't show signs of weakness because you're gonna get chased down,
Right.
eaten up.
Right. And now there seems to be, because we've, like, sort of tried to repress it all seems to be breaking through, and everybody's just screaming and yelling at each other. Their most primitive child tantrums are coming out and stuff like
Yeah,
that,
just to make a
which
point
is
now.
happening to
It's
me
like,
as well. So I think it's in the air. And somehow that, is breaking through all of these masks, and at least, like, oh, that's what we really are. Oh my God, we're in trouble. Right? But it's closer to, the higher self than the mask is. So in that sense, it's a good thing. Yeah. So, and I think our parents' generation, in some ways, they were more survival, and it was more expected, and then, somehow we got to be adolescents for all our lives, and we could bring all this about, but and in some ways, you can recognize in the stoicism and the maturity, perhaps, that was maybe sort of superimposed or enforced. But I think also that generation did have to carry a lot in its back, and somehow, gave to us in these ways that they did, right? And shouldered a lot for us. So, so that we could come and throw our tantrums when things don't go right. It is, I think, a journey that the whole universe is on, and all of mankind. And so hopefully it's going to find a good way beyond itself. I was talking about, like the guide talks about war, and in some of the lectures, and how it'll stop when everybody is ready for it to, right? But probably not anytime soon. There's just a lot of development and growth, and what it would take, I think, is everybody, agreeing somehow that it's not what we want anymore. So let's see, where were we? So, yeah. I'm just going to start here because I can't quite find where I was. So I'm going to start sort of already on this page. So uh, once you go a step further and recognize the damage the idealized self-image has brought into your life, you will shed it as a burden it is. No conviction, theory, or words you hear will make you give it up, but the recognition of what specifically it was supposed to solve, and what damage it has done and is continuing to do, will enable you to dissolve this image of all images. Needless to say, you also have to recognize, most particularly and in detail, what your idealized self-specific demands and standards are. And further, you have to see their unreasonableness, their impossibility. When you have a feeling of acute anxiety and depression, consider the fact that your idealized self may feel questioned and threatened, either by your own limitation, by others, or by life. Recognize the self-contempt that underlies the anxiety or depression. This is very important that we don't usually look for in some way. And when you are compulsively angry at others, consider the possibility that this is but an externalization of your anger at yourself for not living up to the standards of your false self. Do not let it get away with using the excuse of outer problems to account for acute depression or fear. Look into the question from this new angle. Your private and personal work will help you in this direction, but it is almost impossible to do it alone. Only after you have made some substantial progress will you recognize that so many of these outer problems are directly or indirectly the result of the discrepancy between your capacities and the standards of your idealized self and how you deal with this conflict. So as you proceed in this particular phase of the work, you will come to understand the exact nature of your idealized self, its demands, its requirements of self and others in order to maintain the illusion. Once you fully see that what you regarded as commendable is really pride and pretense, you have gained a most substantial insight that enables you to weaken the impact of the idealized self. Then and only will you realize the tremendous self-punishment you inflict upon yourself. For whenever you fall short, as you are bound to, you feel so impatient, so irritated, that your feelings can snowball into fury and wrath at yourself. This fury and wrath are often projected on others because it is too unbearable to be aware of this self-hate. Unless one unrolls this whole process and sees it entire in the light. Nevertheless, even if this hate is unloaded upon others, the effect on the self is still there, and it can cause disease, accident, loss, and outer failure in many ways. So I think, this is something that it took me a long time to see, and I came into this work, the very first lecture I ever ran into the Pathwork was this lecture. And I knew it was the lecture I needed. And then I spent years and years and years working on the idealized self. And, it was, very deep in me and very, intense. And it took a long time. But over the course of that, more and more clearly, I began to see. And what I see is what he's saying here, that we have, like it's unconscious to some degree, but this impatience and irritation that we feel with ourselves actually does snowball into fury and wrath at ourselves. And we may not even recognize it. We may not even know it's there. But that is the most painful thing, because if we are divided against ourselves, if we cannot hold ourselves, the child is truly lost. And the child's trauma wasn't what happened. It was that what happened was never held. What happened was never resolved by being held, explained, somehow repaired, right? The repair never came. And so we have to have this. And if we can't even do it to ourselves, for ourselves, right? This is the kind of foundation of our neuroses. And so giving up the idealized self-image. When you make the very first steps towards giving up the idealized self, you will feel a sense of liberation as never before. And then you will truly be born again. Your real self will emerge, and then you will rest within your real self, centered within. And then you will truly grow, not only on the outer fringes that may have been free of the idealized self-dictatorship, but in every part of your being. This will change many things. First will come changes in your reactions to life, to incidents, to yourself and others. This changed reaction will be astounding enough, but little by little, outer things are also bound to change. Your different attitude will have new effects. The overcoming of your idealized self means overcoming an important aspect of the duality between life and death. At present, you are not even aware of the pressure of your idealized self, of the shame, humiliation, and exposure you fear and sometimes feel, of the tension, strain, and compulsion. If you have an occasional glimpse of such emotions, you do not yet connect them with the fantastic demands of your idealized self. Only after fully seeing these fantastic expectations and their often contradictory imperatives will you relinquish them. The initial inner freedom gained in this way will allow you to deal with life and to stand in life. You will no longer have to hold on frantically to the idealized self. The mere inner activity of holding on so frantically generates a pervasive climate of holding on in general. This is sometimes lived out in external attitudes, but most often it is an inner quality or attitude. As you proceed in this new phase of your work, you will sense and feel this inner tightness, and gradually you will recognize the basic damage it causes. It makes the letting go of many an attitude impossible. It makes it unduly difficult to go through any change that would allow life to bring forth joy and a spirit of vigor. You keep yourself contained within yourself, and thereby you go against life in one of its most fundamental aspects. The words are insufficient. You have to sense, rather, what I mean. You will know exactly when you have weakened your idealized self by fully understanding its function, its causes and effects. And then you will gain the great freedom of giving yourself to life, because you no longer have to hide something from yourself and others. You will be able to squander yourself into life, not in an unhealthy, unreasonable way, but healthily as nature squanders herself. Then and then only will you know the beauty of living. You cannot approach this most important part of your inner work with a general concept. As usual, your most insignificant daily reactions, considered from this viewpoint, will yield the necessary result. So continue your self-search out of these new considerations, and do not be impatient if it takes time and relaxed effort. Coming home. One more word. The difference between the real and the idealized self is often not a question of quantity, but rather of quality. That is, the original motivation is different in these two selves. Maybe the same goal, but the motivation is different. And this will not be easy to see. But as you recognize the demands, the contradictions, the cause and effect sequences, and the difference in motivation will gradually become clear to you. Another important consideration is the time element. The idealized self wants to be perfect according to its specific demands right now. The real self knows this cannot be and does not consider this fact painful or a problem. Of course, you are not perfect. Your present self is a complex of everything you are at the moment. Of course, you have your basic egocentricity, but if you own up to it, you can cope with it. You can learn to understand it and therefore diminish it with each new insight. And then you will truly experience the truth that the more egocentric you are, the less self-confident can you be. The idealized self believes just the opposite. Its claims for perfection are motivated by purely egocentric reasons. And this very egocentricity makes self-confidence impossible. The great freedom of coming home, my friends, is finding your way back to the real you. The expression coming home has often been used in spiritual literature and teachings, but has been much misunderstood. It is often interpreted to mean the return into the spirit world after physical death. Much more is meant by coming home. You may die many deaths, one earth life after another, but if you have not found your real self, you cannot come home. You may be lost and remain lost until you do find the way into the center of your being. On the other hand, you can find your way home right here and right now while you are still in the body. When you muster the courage to become your real self, even though it would seem much less than the idealized self, you will find out that it is much more. Then you will have the peace of being at home within yourself. Then you will find security. Then you will function as a whole human being. Then you will have broken the iron whip of a taskmaster whom it is impossible to obey. Then you will know what peace and security really mean, and you will cease once and for all to seek them by false means. May you all find truth and help and further enlightenment through the words I gave you tonight. However, you should understand and expect that a theoretical understanding will avail you nothing. As long as these words remain theory, concepts, you will not be helped by them. When you begin or continue to work in this direction and allow yourself to feel and observe your emotional reactions connected to your idealized self, then you will make substantial progress in your own liberation and self-finding in the truest sense of the word. My dearest ones, each one of you, receive our love, our strength, and our blessings. Be in peace. Be in God. So this is for next week. And let me stop this share. Okay, so any final closing commentaries or offerings?
Yes. I would say that I think that the doing process work, you know, typically when we do process work, at least when I did process work in my group, I was either getting in touch with my anger or trying to get in touch with my sadness or grief. I will admit that I think I was better at getting in touch with my anger than I was at getting in touch with my sadness or grief. But the point I was getting to is that when you do that, you're touching the truth and the mask falls off. In that moment, when you're in process, the mask is off. And it's typically off like afterwards too, like when you're in what we call the recovery room, you know, you're sitting there and you're just being with what happened and feeling that, okay, I'm in a different state of being right now. Everybody in the room knows how I feel, how I am. And I can't put that mask on right now because everybody's going to see it right away, you know? So there is something to that process work.
Absolutely.
Say that about it.
We have to keep exposing ourselves, which is what, allows us to, so there's risk that we take in that moment, right? To
Right.
drop the mask and be real and see if we survive it, which we do time and time and again, and actually learn to, realize, yeah, I don't need it. It's not really what's helping me at all. So. Good comment. And yes, and anybody that can, try to be in sessions or groups or, because it's in the doing of the work that this stuff really helps. And in the groups, it's beautiful because, you have all your peers and, you're all kind of doing that together, exposing and, and so it's a very profound. And I don't know of any other process exactly. I mean, I don't know. I haven't done all of them or anything like that, but that is as effective in that way, I think, this our Pathwork process groups. So I agree.
I found also that psychedelic drugs will do it for you too.
Definitely have another
Kinda
way
hard,
of getting rid of the mask and
kind of hard to keep the mask on when you're doing psychotropic drugs.
yes. So anybody else? Okay, well, thank you everybody. It was a great discussion, and I hope you're you know getting something from these lectures, and we will continue in the book next time. So it's recreation of childhood hurts, which I think is actually another really good lecture as well. I think that's the one we're doing. Yeah, compulsion to recreate and overcome childhood hurts. So, okay,
Thanks, Dolly.
we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you. Mhm. Good night.
Good night.